Hello, my name is Frank Heile, and I'm going to present a two-agent model of the human brain which provides an explanation of consciousness. I have been developing this model for more than 20 years. It has significantly changed and I hope significantly improved over those 20 years of research. I'm also writing a book about this model with the tentative title of Consciousness and Spirituality Explained. This talk corresponds to part 1 of that book, An Explanation of Consciousness. At the end of this talk, I will briefly introduce the second part of the book, An Explanation of Spirituality. My education includes degrees in physics from Stanford and MIT. My work experience was mostly as a software engineering manager. On the other hand, I've had a lifelong interest in consciousness. I have read many books about it, and I have attended many conferences and talks about consciousness. I have presented earlier versions of this model at more than 35 different events in the past 15 years, including conference concurrent sessions, meetup events, and poster sessions. Last year, I gave a talk at the Complexity Group at Stanford University. The result of all this effort is this current model of consciousness and spirituality. Here's a list of all the different forms of conscious awareness that will be explained by this talk. First of all, I will explain the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. This distinction was proposed by the NYU philosopher Professor Ned Block. Then I will explain these 3 different kinds of human consciousness: modern human consciousness, flow state consciousness, and enlightened states of consciousness. These enlightened states are also described as having an experience of non-duality. At the end of this talk, I will propose answers to each of these 3 questions. Why does conscious awareness seem to be fundamentally non-physical and to not have a location in space? What conditions cause conscious awareness to arise? And can conscious awareness exist without a self? I don't expect that everyone will agree with the answers I will propose, but I do think this model supplies interesting and hopefully informative answers to these questions. This explanation of consciousness is based on 3 core ideas. First, we will use the good regulator theorem, which proves that a good agent needs to have a model of the world where the agent operates. Second, we'll propose a 2-agent model of the human brain. Third, we will use attention schema theory as our model of conscious awareness. This model or theory of awareness was proposed by Princeton neuroscientist Professor Michael Graziano. The purpose of this talk is to provide a high-level functional block model of the human brain. 2 of the blocks are the 2 proposed agents, and one of these agents will also contain 2 different mechanisms that I believe are closely related to 2 different kinds of conscious awareness. I will describe the functions that each of the agents and mechanisms implements, the interfaces between the agents, and the interfaces to the external world. The model will be guided by our own everyday experiences of conscious awareness and will also be informed by scientific research results reported by psychology and neuroscience. In this talk, I will guide you through some of these everyday experiences so you can have that first-hand experience for yourself. This model will not provide any information about how the proposed functionality is implemented in specific brain regions. It is likely that large networks of neurons in multiple different regions of the brain will correspond to each of the proposed parts of this functional model. Instead, this talk will be proposing a kind of idealized top-down engineering design of the human brain. A 500 million years of messy evolution of brains has undoubtedly resulted in a far from idealized design. However, I am convinced there's a lot of truth in this model, and by the end of the talk, I hope you will agree. Here is the outline of the talk. You can see we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dig in and start with descriptions of agents and world models. An agent is an entity that has goals, a way of sensing the world, and a way to make changes to the world to achieve those goals. By this definition, a human is an agent. We have lots of goals, but all the goals could be placed into three major categories: to survive, to reproduce, and to be social. We can sense and change the world, and we seem to be successful at achieving many of our goals. So we are all agents. A not very well-known control systems theorem from 1970 says that every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. Here, a regulator is an agent, and a system is the world where the agent operates. Therefore, this system says that a good agent needs a model of the world. In this theorem, a good agent is an optimally simple and optimally effective agent. Evolution is said to be survival of the fittest, which could be restated as survival of the most effective. Therefore, evolution is trying to optimize effectiveness, and it seems that humans are the most effective large animal on the planet. Imagine a bacterium that had no model of the world at all. The only thing that bacteria could do would be to move in random directions to find food. Then consider a bacterial model of the world where the bacteria can sense chemical gradients. They use these gradients to determine which direction to move. This allows these bacteria to be much more effective at finding food and avoiding dangerous environments than a bacterium that just moves in random directions. As animals develop better sense organs for many different kinds of senses, they are able to develop better and better sensory models of the world, which can produce more effective animals. Humans have pretty good senses, but for each different kind of human sense organ, there are many animals that have better senses than humans. So why are humans the most effective large animal on the planet? I claim the main advantage that modern humans have is our extensive, shared, abstract, conceptual model of the world, which I will talk about in a few slides. The point is that better models of the world can allow an animal to be more effective. So the optimally effective animal must have a very good model of the world. So for now, let's just assume that humans are getting closer and closer to being optimally effective. Now notice that the theorem says the optimal agent is a model of the world. In other words, it is just a model of the world and nothing else. Basically, the paper proves the existence of a kind of isomorphism between the important states of the world and the states of the optimally simple and effective agent. Thus, this is where the optimally simple requirement is necessary. The paper notes that if two agents are both optimally effective, but one of them is more complicated than the other, then the more complicated agent will just be unnecessarily complex. For example, there could be internal states of the agent that do not correspond to the important states of the world. Thus, for an optimally effective but complex agent, that agent will contain a model of the world plus some additional unneeded states. Evolution is certainly not noted for producing the simplest possible solution to a problem, so we are probably not optimally simple. All this means is that instead of being equal to a model of the world, we simply need to contain a model of the world. In the last paragraph of this paper, the authors discuss brains. And in the last sentence of that paper, the authors state, "There can no longer be questions about whether the brain models its environment. It must." I added the emphasis on "it must." Thus, the human brain must contain a model of the world. If an agent is part of the world, then the agent needs a self-model. Note that since the agent is part of the world, the self-model is completely contained within and is part of the world model. The only thing special about the self-model is that it is a simplified model of the agent itself. Since humans are part of the world, humans will have a self-model that is included in our world model. Let's talk a little more about humanity's shared abstract conceptual model of the world, which could also be called a model of reality. We start with a single human, which has goals to survive, reproduce, and to be social. Using language, humans as a group have been trying to create a shared abstract conceptual model of reality that is known as science. This includes mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology, plus all the other sciences. The discoveries of science have enabled the development of a lot of technologies. These would include electronics, the internet, medicine, and material science. These technologies permitted the development of tools, such as computers, cell phones, social media apps, and pharmaceuticals. And all these tools and technologies allowed science to develop further and to create more accurate abstract conceptual models of the world. Going around this loop many times has resulted in an exponential growth in our shared model of reality. I claim this exponential growth began with the development of the science of biology about 10 to 15,000 years ago, which was demonstrated by the technology of agriculture. Now, these modern tools and technologies have enabled the individual human to be even more effective at meeting their goals. For example, only a small fraction of our population can produce the food needed by all of humanity. And we live much longer and are healthier because of the developments of medicine and pharmaceuticals. Modern humans can also have the fun of reproducing without needing to raise large families. And finally, technology allows us to be social with friends and family that live thousands of miles away from us. This is an example of how developing a better world model can optimize an agent's effectiveness. These bottom three boxes together represent humanity's shared abstract conceptual model of reality. Any individual human can only contain a very small slice of this entire conceptual model, but by working together, we have accomplished a lot and have dominated this planet. Evolution's key breakthrough was the development of language, which allowed us to create this abstract conceptual model of the world. So each human contains a model of the world. The main purpose of this world model is to predict future states of the world. Accurate predictions allow an agent to plan an effective action which has the best chance of achieving the agent's goals. The world is not completely deterministic, so we cannot have perfect predictions. Our goal is to optimize the accuracy of our predictions. The world model contains a sensory world model, which can predict future states of the sensory world model, plus an abstract conceptual world model, which is just a small slice of humanity's shared abstract conceptual world model, and the memories of past sensory and language inputs. This is one way we can learn to predict future states of the world. We assume the future will be like the past. Since humans are very social creatures, our world model will include many detailed models of all the other humans that we know and interact with. These models allow us to predict how other people might act depending on what we do. Finally, the world model contains our own self-model. Now the question is, do we experience the world directly, or do we only experience our model of the world? Colors can help answer that question. The way colors work is that the eye contains three different kinds of neurons that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. So the information the brain receives from the eye is equivalent to three black and white images like this. The brain takes that information and produces this experience of colors. The experiences of colors such as red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet only exist in your brain. They do not exist out there in the world. Now, some people would say that the colors do only exist in the brain, but what the colors are telling you is about the wavelengths of light entering the eye. My answer is that colors are more complicated than that. To see why, let's look at a color optical illusion. In this image, do you experience that the left and right rectangles are the same color? I don't. To me, the left rectangle is a kind of bluish green, and the right is a yellowish green. Yet the same spectrum of light is entering the eye from these two rectangles. To prove that they are the same color, I will now erase the purple and orange bars over the rectangles in the bottom half of this image. So now you have three very different color experiences with exactly the same spectrum of light entering the eyes. Why does this happen? Well, the brain has a mechanism called either color constancy or discounting the illuminant, which tries to give you the same color experience for a scene no matter what the spectrum of light is illuminating that scene. For example, at noon, sunlight is considered to be white light, but at sunset, the light has a reddish hue. The color constancy mechanism would try to give you the same green color for a green apple at both noon and at sunset, so you would not think that the apple was a red apple at sunset. This mechanism works pretty well in the natural kind of scenes where we evolved, but the purple and orange bars in this image apparently trigger this mechanism to produce three different color experiences in this non-natural scene. So the color experience is not just about the wavelengths of light entering the eye. It is a complicated function of the wavelengths of light entering the eye and an estimate of the wavelengths of light that are illuminating the scene we are looking at. This illusion shows that this complicated function sometimes gets confused in these kinds of non-natural scenes. Why am I talking about illusions? I am trying to show that we are experiencing our model of the world and that this model may not match reality. This usually only happens in non-natural scenes like this. Our brain is usually pretty good at modeling the kinds of natural scenes where we evolved. But whether this scene is a natural scene or a non-natural scene, we are still only experiencing our model of the world. More evidence that we are experiencing our model of the world is that what we experience is not the information the eyes are sending to the brain. The reason I claim this is that visual acuity drops rapidly as you move away from the center of vision. And then there is the blind spot, which is on different sides of the center of vision in the two eyes. Yet, when we look out at the world, we experience something like this. Keep your center of vision directed at the green star on this image and experience this scene. Don't you experience that all the houses in the scene are crisp and in focus out to the edge of the screen? In fact, the world beyond this screen also seems to be crisp and in focus. However, the information the eye sends to the brain looks more like this. As you move away from the center of vision, the world gets more and more blurry. And then there is the blind spot. The two blind spots do not overlap, so you could imagine that one eye could fill in the blind spot for the other eye. However, even if you close one eye, you still do not see the blind spot. The reason why we don't experience the blurry vision and blind spot is because what we experience is our model of the world. The model of the world knows there is no blind spot out there in the world, and that the world does not get blurry in the periphery. It knows this because when the center of vision is moved around in a visual scene like this, it always finds everything to be crisp and in focus. So the model of the world makes sure that we always experience everything as crisp and in focus. In the center of vision, where we have a high visual acuity, the visual information coming from the eye may cause the world model to be updated if the sensory information is not consistent with our world model. But out in the periphery, as long as the blurry sensory information coming in from the eye doesn't contradict the current world model, we will just continue to experience the current world model. So all we ever experience is the visual world model. Another example that shows that what we experience is not the information the eyes are sending to the brain comes from rapid eye saccades. A rapid eye saccade occurs when the eye quickly moves from one fixation point to another. The image of the world on the retina will shift significantly when we do a saccade, and yet we do not experience that the world is moving at all. Try that experiment right now. Perform a few saccades, and you will not see the world moving. It seems absolutely stationary. If you want to experience the world moving, imagine that an insect is flying around in a small circle in front of your face and try to track the path of this imaginary insect with your eyes. You will see the world swirl around in circles. One reason why we do not experience the world moving during a saccade is that we are momentarily blind when the eye is moving. For a larger saccade, the blindness can last up to 2/10 of a second. You can experience this blindness yourself by getting your face close to a mirror and rapidly looking back and forth from the right eye to the left eye and back again. You will always experience a rock-solid world model with eyes that look like they never moved. You don't experience the motion because you were blind while the eyes were moving. The other amazing thing is that you do not experience that blindness at all. The reason you don't experience the blindness is that you are not experiencing the information the eyes are sending to the brain. You are always and only experiencing the visual model of the world. So while the eyes are moving during a saccade, you still continue to experience your static image of the world model. On the other hand, if you use your front-facing cell phone camera as a mirror and perform this experiment, you will see the last part of the eye's movement. There's a small signal processing delay from the camera to the screen, which allows you to see this eye movement. All of this is more evidence that what we experience is the visual world model, not what our eyes are sending to the brain. Our visual world model knows that the world does not move when we perform a saccade, and that is why we don't experience movement. On the other hand, when you are trying to track that imaginary flying insect, the brain could not cause blindness since the object of that experiment is to see the flying insect. If you were able to track a flying insect, you would see a stationary insect with the world moving around behind the insect. So you only experience the visual world model, not the information the eyes are sending to the brain. The same is true for any sense. You are experiencing the world model for that sense, not the information the sense organ is sending to the brain. So let's consider the sense of touch. There are about a dozen different kinds of sensors in our skin, such as sensors for 3 different frequencies of vibration, sensors that detect the skin stretching or slipping. There are chemical sensors in the skin of the eyes, and there are multiple different kinds of pain sensors. Finally, there are 4 different kinds of temperature sensors for warm, cool, painfully hot, or painfully cold surfaces. Just as there are visual illusions, there can also be illusions in the sense of touch. Here's a touch illusion you can experience yourself at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. This illusion uses the warm and cool sensors in the skin. There are 2 copper tubes with warm water and cool water circulating in them. On the right coil, your hand experiences the cool sensation, and on the left coil, your hand experiences the warm sensation. But in the center section, the warm and cool coils alternate. So what do you think you would feel if you put your hand on that center section? Maybe something between warm and cool? What do people report? Well, first of all, it feels weird when you put your hand on that center section. In a natural environment, you would probably never encounter a surface like this. If you ask people to describe that feeling, the huge majority of people would say that it feels painfully hot. You are really tempted to pull your hand away from the center section. This illusion in the sense of touch is another example which shows that the world model can differ from the actual world and that what we experience is the world model. Now I'll try to demonstrate that every sensory experience that we have is totally arbitrary. When we touch a warm or a cool surface, we have a certain sensory experience that we label as warm or cool. We think those sensations somehow accurately represent the actual true temperature of the surface. What happens in our body is that signals from the warm and cool thermoreceptors in the skin travel through the spinal cord to neurons in the brain that process those warm and cool signals. This eventually results in the warm or cool sensation that we experience. These experiences have nothing to do with the actual surface we are touching. For example, imagine that we could magically rewire the axons in the human spinal cord such that the warm and cool signals are swapped. Then when we touch a surface that we previously labeled as warm, we would now experience a cool sensation and vice versa. Thus, the meanings of warm and cool sensations would effectively have been swapped. So the experiences of warm and cool are not at all the same as the temperature of surfaces. These experiences are completely arbitrary, brain-created labels for temperatures. Similarly, for the sensations we get with color vision. When we look at a colored surface, we have a certain color experience, and we also give a specific verbal label for that experience. We think the color experience somehow represents the actual true nature of that surface, thus that surfaces have an intrinsic color. What happens is that signals from the color receptors in the eye travel through the optic nerve to neurons in the brain that process those color signals. This eventually results in the color experience. I claim that those color experiences have nothing to do with the actual surface we are looking at. Imagine that we could magically rewire the axons in the optic nerve such that all the color signals are swapped. Then, when we look at a surface that we said was a blue surface, we would now have the red color experience, etc. Obviously, the word labels for colors are completely arbitrary labels, since different words are used for colors in different languages. This shows that the color sensory experiences themselves are also completely arbitrary labels, since they could be switched around by this kind of magical neural rewiring. I claim that every sensory experience of the world model is, effectively, an arbitrary label for a particular aspect or property of that model of the world. Red, green, and blue visual experiences are approximate and arbitrary labels for wavelengths of light. Warm and cool touch experiences are approximate and arbitrary labels for temperatures of surfaces. And finally, the experience of our body is the experience of our own self-model in the model of the world. Therefore, we are human self-models living in and experiencing our model of the world. It is commonly said that perception is about identifying and interpreting sensory information. I think a better definition is that perception is the experience of our world model. For example, dream experiences are us living in a free-running model of the world that is not guided by sensory input. The world model is predicting future world model states all on its own. So if we are perceiving in a dream, we are not identifying and interpreting sensory information. We must be perceiving that free-running world model itself. On the other hand, normal waking experiences occur when the world model is constantly constrained by sensory input. Although the senses constrain the world model, we do not directly perceive sensory information. We always and only perceive the world model with our experiences. Now let's talk about the two-agent model of the human brain. The first agent is the controller that controls the body. The second agent is the modeler that creates the model of the world. The controller produces all behavior in speech. It also produces the inner voice or inner visualizations that we experience. If you were wondering to yourself, what inner voice is he talking about? That's it, right there. That's the inner voice. The justification for including the inner voice and visualizations in the controller is that the inner voice is similar to external speech, and the inner visualizations can be used to practice or plan behaviors. The controller also produces the feelings and emotions that we experience. This is justified since feelings and emotions can be motivations that drive behaviors. Given a controller, the modeler is required by the good regulator theorem. The modeler includes a sensory model of the world and a completely abstract conceptual world model. These are not two separate world models. They are really two ends of a continuum of conceptual models from low-level sensory concepts at one end to the fully abstract high-level concepts at the other end. For example, in the visual sensory system, the first step is to detect edges, then the edges are joined together to define surfaces, and surfaces are combined to identify objects. Edges, surfaces, and objects are all concepts. And all these concepts are part of the low-level visual sensory processing system. An example at the high end of the continuum are the completely abstract concepts used in mathematics. Finally, the only action the modeler performs is to direct attention appropriately. Here's a block diagram of the two agents. For the human being as a whole, all inputs, including the senses and language inputs, are on the left, while all outputs, including control of the body and language outputs, are on the right. The modeler creates the model of the world by using the sensory inputs to update the sensory world model and using the language inputs to update the abstract conceptual world model. The only action the modeler performs is to direct attention. The modeler is the source for intuition, and it contains the goals and the self-models of all the agents. The three agents are the modeler, controller, and human as a whole. The controller controls the body and produces the language output. The controller also produces the inner voice and visualizations. Instead of always reciting inner voice and visualizations, I will sometimes refer to these as just thoughts. They can either be conscious verbal or conscious visual thoughts. Note that these thoughts are not sourced by intuition. My definition of intuition is that it is knowing how the world works without thinking. So intuition comes from the world model within the modeler, while thoughts come into the modeler from the controller. Now, both the thoughts and intuitions can produce insights about the world. The difference is that thoughts are effortful. You must consciously think about the situation and try out various ideas until you, the controller, arrives at a useful insight about how the world works. On the other hand, intuitions are effortless. They just pop into our awareness without any effort, and we, the modeler, immediately know they are correct since they came from the world model itself. The controller also produces the feelings and emotions. Notice that all these things that we can consciously aware of are precisely the inputs to the modeler. While the modeler is directing attention, the modeler is determining the currently important parts of the world model that should be passed through this interface to the controller. Directing attention to an object results in an experience of awareness of that object. Let's try an example from the sense of touch. Direct your bodily sensations to your feet. Do you perhaps feel a tingling sensation? Or is there a sensation from where the shoes contact your feet? Or is there a feeling of pressure on your feet from the floor? Those sensations must have always been there, but you were not aware of them until you directed your attention to your feet. That is an example of how directing attention to a target results in an experience of awareness of that target. In the visual world, the main way we direct visual attention to an object is to move our eyes so that the center of vision points at that object. We do this because the highest visual acuity is located at the center of vision. However, on the next slide, we will see that the modeler does have the ability to direct peripheral visual attention to objects in the periphery without moving our eyes. So which agent controls the eyes? Since vision is probably the most important sense, and since the modeler directs attention, the modeler usually has control, either directly or indirectly, of moving the eyes so that the center of vision is located on the desired target location. If the modeler has direct control, the controller still has the ability to override the modeler, so in that sense, we can still say that the controller does have complete control of the body, even though the modeler is the agent that usually moves the eyes. If the modeler only had indirect control, then the controller always controls the eyes, but it usually moves the eyes as requested by the modeler. I think these two views are equivalent, and the important point is that the modeler chooses the visual attention targets as part of its function of directing attention. The neural mechanism that directs attention is called the focal attention mechanism. And this focal attention mechanism is what gives us the focal awareness experience. Most of the literature just calls this the attention mechanism. I am calling it the focal attention mechanism since we usually are focusing our attention on either one object or a few objects simultaneously. The other reason for calling it the focal attention mechanism is to distinguish it from the other attention mechanism that I will introduce later. Here is an example of peripheral visual focal attention and focal awareness. In this image, please keep your eyes on the center green star so that you see the star and the center house behind it. Because of your central visual attention and awareness, you immediately see that the center house is mostly tan. Now, Without moving your eyes, try to answer this question. What color is the house on the right? If you were successful at not moving your eyes, you should have experienced that you were able to direct your peripheral visual attention to the house on the right, and that enabled you to say that the house on the right is a light blue. Hopefully you noticed the effort it took to shift peripheral visual attention without moving your eyes. Similarly, while keeping your eyes on the green star, try to determine the color of the house on the left. Again, without moving your eyes, you would have had to shift peripheral visual attention to the left to be able to experience that the house on the left is yellow and orange. So you have just personally experienced your peripheral visual focal attention mechanism and your peripheral visual focal attention awareness. Here's another example where you will use peripheral visual attention to simultaneously track moving objects. The video in this slide is an example of the kind of videos that cognitive scientists use to determine the number of peripheral objects that can be tracked simultaneously. By the way, their answer is that it depends on how fast the objects move. If the objects move slowly, 8 objects can be tracked, 4 if they move at the speed of this video, and only 1 if the object moves very fast. The instructions are to always keep your eyes centered on the plus sign at the center of the screen. In all my slides, I will use a black arrow to denote the location of the center of vision in the world model. Then the experimenters would have made a subset of the dots flash to indicate that you should pay attention to those dots when they start moving. Note that all the dots will move around on the screen, but the experimenters only want you to pay attention to those 4 dots. I will use red arrows to indicate the locations of these 4 targets for your peripheral visual attention. When I first tried to do this task with 4 dots that flashed, I failed. On the second try, I did succeed. However, it is much easier to track only 2 of the dots. So my recommendation is that you just try to track dots numbered 1 and 2 in this image. It's your choice to do just 2 or 3 or even all 4 dots if you want. Do you have your dots picked? In just a second, the dots will start to move. Here are the final resting spots of the 4 objects you could have tracked. Were you successful at tracking your chosen dots? So you have now experienced how your visual focal attention mechanism tracked multiple moving objects, and you have also experienced the corresponding visual focal awareness. Based on this example, let's look at the 2 models that are part of the focal attention mechanism. The focal attention mechanism probably involves many billions of neurons, and these neurons would probably connect a large number of different regions of the brain. For example, it would probably connect sensory regions in the back of the brain to some regions in the frontal lobes. Now, in order to control this complicated focal attention process, the good regulator theorem says that the modeler will require a model of this process. And the focal attention schema is exactly that simplified model of this focal attention mechanism. This is the first model that is part of the focal attention mechanism. By the way, the word schema here simply means a model, a plan, or a representation of some kind. So what is included in the focal attention schema? Well, this model includes the modality where the attention is directed. Examples of sensory modalities are vision, hearing, or bodily sensations. The modality would also include experiences such as the inner voice, inner visualizations, the feelings, and the emotions. As you can see, this list of possible modalities is simply the list of all the kinds of things that we can be aware of. It would also include the locations of the attention targets. For vision, this would be the target locations in the visual world model. For the bodily sensations, it would be the locations on the body. For hearing, we can sometimes determine the approximate direction where the sound came from, so that would be the location direction for hearing. The focal attention schema would also include the specific features attended. For example, in vision, we could be paying attention to either the color, the texture, or the shape of an object. For music, we could attend to the vocals, the piano, the drums, or any other instrument. Now, in diagrams, I will typically use an arrow to represent each separate target of the focal attention mechanism, and I will often refer to the term arrow location to represent all of these parts of the focal attention schema, which does include the location of the target in the world model where appropriate. The second model that is part of the focal attention mechanism would be the focal model, which is the contents of awareness. For vision, it would be the relatively small parts of the visual world model that you were paying attention to. Thus, the focal model is always a small subset of the world model. So the two models that are part of the focal attention mechanism are the focal attention schema and the focal model. Let's make this clearer using the moving dot tracking experiment. When you were keeping your center vision on the plus sign, the focal model would just be an image of the plus sign. The attention schema for the center of vision would indicate the location of the central vision in the visual world model. I'll always use a black arrow to indicate the attention schema location for central vision. The several peripheral focal models would be the images of the round dots that were being tracked. I will always use red arrows for the peripheral visual attention schema locations. Therefore, these red arrow locations in the visual world model indicate the locations of the tracked dots before the movie played and after the movie played. Let's look at the focal models and focal attention schemas in the example where we directed peripheral visual attention at the row of houses. In this example, the eyes were always directed at the green star, so the central vision attention schema would point to the center house. Then we directed peripheral visual attention to the house on the right, and then to the house on the left, and back to the center house only. Note that the world model did not change when we directed peripheral visual attention to different objects. The model that does change is the focal model. As peripheral visual attention was directed to the house on the right, and then to the house on the left, the focal model did change appropriately, revealing more information about the house to the right or to the left of the center house, respectively. Let's review what we know about focal attention and focal awareness. The focal attention schema is a simplified model of the focal attention mechanism, and the focal attention mechanism gives us the focal awareness experience. Here I'm going to give you a preview of attention schema theory, which says that the focal attention schema is a simplified model of the focal awareness experience. This statement of attention schema theory is almost a logical consequence of the two previous statements. That's why I think that attention schema theory is, in some sense, true, even if you think the ultimate explanation of consciousness is some completely different theory. For example, if the integrated information theory of consciousness is the true ultimate explanation of consciousness, then attention schema theory could still be a valid model of the conscious awareness produced by integrated information theory. If the attention schema is defined as a simplified model of the actual mechanism that through this other theory produces awareness, then it would still be true that the attention schema is a simplified model of that conscious awareness. So let's apply this attention schema theory to an agent. If an agent claims focal awareness of an object in words, then the self-model of the agent has a focal awareness experience of the focal model. Attention schema theory says you would replace the focal awareness experience with the focal attention schema. So the model of focal awareness is the self-model plus the focal attention schema plus the focal model. That, in a nutshell, is attention schema theory. So far, we have been talking about focal awareness. Now let's talk about a very different kind of awareness, which I will call diffuse awareness. Once again, keep your eyes focused on the green star. You are now experiencing focal awareness of the green star and of the center house behind it. Now, while keeping your eyes focused on the green star, drop your focal awareness and instead experience your diffuse awareness of all the houses on the screen. Now, with your center of vision still on the green star, expand your diffuse awareness even further and experience all the objects in the room that are beyond the edges of the screen. That diffuse visual world you are experiencing should extend out to the edges of vision, almost a complete hemisphere. Don't try to mentally describe any of those objects. Just experience your awareness of all the objects in the room while your eyes are still on the green star. Doesn't that feel different than the feeling of focal awareness of the green star? Try switching back and forth from focal awareness of the green star and the diffuse awareness of everything else in the room. Notice how your feeling of awareness changes each time you switch. Now, while keeping your eyes on the green star, pick some random object in the room beyond the edges of the screen. In your head, try to describe the shape or color or some other attribute of that object using only diffuse awareness. Didn't you experience a strong desire to move your eyes to focus on that object? Resist that temptation and mentally try to describe some details about the chosen peripheral object. Are you able to describe the object using only diffuse awareness? Or did you end up using peripheral visual focal attention to be able to describe the object? Now choose another different peripheral object and try to do the same thing using only diffuse awareness. In other words, try to not use your peripheral visual focal attention. Didn't you find it was impossible to describe the object without using peripheral visual focal attention? The bottom line is that diffuse peripheral visual awareness alone is not enough to describe peripheral objects. Your controller doesn't get any information about the object using just diffuse awareness. Only peripheral visual focal attention gives the controller the experience of peripheral visual focal awareness, and it is only focal awareness which allows the controller to describe peripheral objects. Another interesting fact about diffuse peripheral visual awareness is that moving objects are very noticeable in diffuse awareness. One reason for this is that motion detection begins directly in the eye, since there are neurons in the retina that respond selectively to the speed and direction of motion of objects. Because of the sensitivity to motion, diffuse awareness can be particularly noticeable if there are any moving objects in the visual world. Try to notice this effect the next time you are walking around or driving. In these situations, almost every object in the peripheral visual world will be moving relative to you, and those moving objects will be very noticeable. In fact, I think that driving with diffuse awareness can be the safest way to drive, since it will be impossible to pay focal attention to your cell phone. Now I'm going to propose a diffuse attention mechanism that produces this diffuse awareness experience. To do that, I will assume the diffuse attention mechanism has similarities to the focal attention mechanism. So let's review the models used by the focal attention mechanism. Directing focal attention to objects gives focal awareness, which involves the focal attention schemas and the awareness of the focal models. Here's a second example of focal attention schemas and focal models that you experienced. I'm proposing a similar diffuse attention mechanism using this same kind of paradigm. Similarly, directing diffuse attention to the whole world gives us the diffuse awareness of the whole world, which involves the diffuse attention schema and awareness of the whole world model. So the new hypothetical model I am introducing here is the diffuse attention schema. I've drawn this as a ball of arrow locations to suggest that this mechanism must always pay attention to the entire world model. We have now described two models for the focal attention mechanism and two models for the diffuse attention mechanism, and all these models are created by the modeler. Let's look at those four models that the modeler creates. We will call these four models the modeler's complete world, since it creates and updates all four of these models, not just the world model. We have two different attention mechanisms, and each mechanism contains an attention schema and a model of the object being attended. Let's extend attention schema theory to this new diffuse attention mechanism. The diffuse attention schema is a simplified model of the diffuse attention mechanism, and the diffuse attention mechanism gives us the diffuse awareness experience. This is a preview of how I will extend attention schema theory to apply to the diffuse attention schema. I will say that the diffuse attention schema is a simplified model of the diffuse awareness experience. Again, this statement of extended attention schema theory is almost the logical consequence of the two previous statements. So let's apply this extended attention schema theory to an agent. If an agent claims diffuse awareness of the world in words, then the self-model of the agent has the diffuse awareness experience of the world model. Extended attention schema theory says you would replace the diffuse awareness experience with the diffuse attention schema. So the model of diffuse attention awareness is the self-model plus the diffuse attention schema plus the world model. So far, we have applied attention schema theory to both the focal and diffuse attention mechanisms. However, it turns out that there are two different subtypes of focal attention. First, there is a top-down focal attention mechanism where the attention target is chosen by the controller. An example of this is a baseball outfielder's controller will direct the modeler to keep top-down attention on the baseball that has been hit towards his position so that he can run to intercept and catch the ball. Second, there is a bottom-up focal attention mechanism where the attention target is chosen by the modeler. There are two different reasons why a target will be chosen for bottom-up attention. The first reason is if something happens in the world which was not predicted by the current world model. For example, a sudden loud noise, or perhaps an object or a person that is behaving unusually. The second reason would be if a goal object has been detected in the world model. This goal object can either be an attractive goal or an aversive goal. An example of an attractive goal model for me would be a bowl of ice cream. An aversive goal would be an angry person. So if one of these goal objects appears in the world model, bottom-up attention will be directed to the object so I, the controller, can perform an appropriate action, such as eating the ice cream or avoiding the angry person. Generally, the focal attention target would be the current most important part of the world model that the modeler needs to share with the controller. The top-down targets are what the controller thinks are the most important targets, and the bottom-up targets are what the modeler thinks are the most important. Another hypothesis that I am proposing is that the modeler uses the diffuse attention mechanism to find these bottom-up attention targets. I am proposing that there is a third function that the diffuse attention mechanism must perform. Besides the two functions I've already described, the diffuse awareness mechanism would also update the world model based on the current sensory inputs. I claim that all three of these actions require that the diffuse attention of some kind is directed at the entire world model, and that it's reasonable to assume that the diffuse attention mechanism is the common mechanism behind these three functions. So my proposal is that the diffuse attention mechanism produces the diffuse awareness we have of the entire world, and it finds bottom-up focal attention targets anywhere in the world, and it updates any part of the world model with the current sensory information. This is why the diffuse attention schema must have arrows that point to the entire world model. All three of these functions require that. So we have two different attention mechanisms in the modeler's complete world. The focal attention mechanism implements top-down and bottom-up focal attention and produces the focal awareness experience. The diffuse attention mechanism updates the world model, finds bottom-up focal attention targets, and produces the diffuse awareness experience. Let's see how these functions are performed. Note that the diffuse attention schema is a simplified model of the diffuse attention mechanism. An extended attention schema theory says that diffuse attention schema is a model of the diffuse awareness experience. I am proposing that it's also a model of the mechanism that updates the world model and that finds bottom-up focal attention targets. As you will see, these two functions are closely connected, and I think these functions also produce the diffuse awareness experience. Let's start by showing how the diffuse attention mechanism updates the world model. The process starts when new sensory input is available. The idea is that the diffuse attention mechanism will continuously recognize the objects that can be found in the sensory input. Here I am showing visual object recognition, but every sensory modality has its own kind of sensory objects. For example, your bodily senses have effectively formed a model of the chair you are sitting in, and the senses of hearing finds objects such as words and speech or melodies and music. The objects found are continuously compared to the current model of the world, or rather what the current model of the world would predict for the current moment. This recognition of sensory objects in comparison to the world model objects are where the diffuse awareness experience is produced. If some object has changed, or if a new object appears in the sensory input, such as this red flashing square, then the diffuse attention mechanism will determine which diffuse attention schema arrow location points to the world model location that will need to be updated. This diffuse attention schema arrow location will then be activated like this. Next, the diffuse attention mechanism will update the world model with a copy of the new or changed object found in the new sensory information. So at this point, we switch from updating the world model mode to finding bottom-up focal attention targets mode. This diffuse attention schema arrow location will remain activated since this is now a location where we might find a bottom-up focal attention target. If this object does not meet the requirements for being a new bottom-up focal attention target, then the activated arrow would just be deactivated. However, if the object does meet the requirements, then the activated arrow will be added to the focal attention schema, and the flashing red square will be added to the focal model. Note that for as long as that arrow is a focal attention target, the corresponding diffuse attention schema arrow will remain activated. Basically, every focal attention schema arrow is a continuation of the corresponding diffuse attention schema arrow. That is, there's just one arrow rooted at the diffuse attention schema that terminates in the focal attention schema. Thus, the red and black focal attention schema arrows locations shown in this diagram will also have an activated root in the diffuse attention schema as long as they are focal targets. You could think of the diffuse attention schema arrows as being part of the brain's primary sensory cortex that gets activated by sensory change, and that the focal attention schema arrow represents how information about those areas gets transmitted to the frontal lobes. So, if you are familiar with global workspace theory of consciousness, the focal attention mechanism is the global workspace, and it has three components: the activated diffuse attention schema arrows, the corresponding focal attention schema arrows, and the focal models. So this is how finding bottom-up focal attention targets produces bottom-up focal attention and the focal awareness experience. Now the modeler creates all four of these models. However, only the two focal attention mechanism models are made available to the controller. So the interface between the modeler and controller must be part of the focal attention mechanism. So we can replace this interface between the modeler and controller with a focal attention mechanism. However, the diffuse attention mechanisms are completely contained in the modeler. That is why the controller could not describe peripheral visual diffuse awareness objects without using the focal attention mechanism. Thus, we see that only the modeler can have diffuse awareness, whereas both the controller and modeler can have focal awareness since they share the focal attention schema and focal model. As we've already shown, the focal attention mechanism is very connected to the diffuse attention mechanism, every focal attention schema arrow location is simultaneously an activated diffuse attention schema arrow location. So when a true top-down attention target has been activated, it will have to start with the activation of the corresponding diffuse attention schema arrow. Therefore, the diffuse attention mechanism is also used for top-down focal attention targets. In addition, I claim that only a very small number of true top-down attention targets are ever directly chosen by the controller. This is because the controller does not have access to the whole world model. It only has access to the focal model. Thus, the only time that the new top-down target can be directly chosen by the controller is when that new top-down target is already visible in the current focal model. I will use the example of the houses shown in this slide to demonstrate this process. I recommend that you direct your center of vision to the focal model and use your peripheral focal attention to pay attention to changes in the focal attention schema and the diffuse attention schema. Note that there are 3 arrows in both the focal and diffuse attention schemas. In this example, the center of vision was directed to the house shown on the right in the focal model, and the peripheral visual attention was directed to the house on the left. So the controller could tell the modeler to shift the center of vision from the house on the right over to the house on the left, like this. In the focal model, you've seen how there is now only an image of the one house that used to be on the left. And in both the focal and diffuse attention schemas, you have seen how the center of vision was moved appropriately by the modeler as requested by the controller. And that there are now only 2 arrows in the focal and diffuse attention schemas. Similarly, the controller could ask the modeler to not pay attention to the flashing red square anymore, like this. At this point, there is only 1 arrow in the focal and diffuse attention schemas. However, if the new center of vision is not visible in the current focal model, the best the controller can do is to provide the modeler with a conceptual attention goal that would hopefully result in a bottom-up attention being directed at the target the controller desired. For example, let's say that someone said they would meet you at some event and that they would be wearing a red shirt. The controller could send a conceptual request for bottom-up attention to the modeler to direct attention to any red objects in the visual field. Then the modeler directs bottom-up attention to red objects so the controller can see if one of these is the shirt of the person the controller wanted to meet. Another example of a conceptual goal target occurred during your diffuse awareness experience. You kept your center of vision directed at the plus sign in the center of the screen and experienced diffuse awareness of the whole visual world. I then asked you to pick some random object in the room that was not on the screen. The controller cannot pick that object because the controller only has the focal model available to it. And the focal model did not contain the whole visual scene. So your controller must have asked your modeler to pick a random object in the periphery. The modeler would then pick a random object and direct bottom-up peripheral visual attention to that object. Your controller would then see the object chosen in the focal model and agree to that object or ask the modeler for a new random object. So what might have seemed like a controller top-down attention target was a modeler bottom-up conceptual attention target goal instead. A final example of a conceptual goal target was during the moving dots tracking experiment. The experimenter asked the subjects to keep their center of vision on the plus sign on the screen. They were then instructed to track the 4 moving dots that had flashed for a few seconds at the beginning of the experiment. The fact that these 4 dots flashed would have directed the modeler's bottom-up attention to those dots to inform the controller about the unusual flashing dots. At that point, the flashing dots were in the controller's focal model, so it could then give the conceptual goal to the modeler to continue to keep focal attention directed at those 4 dots when they stopped flashing and to follow those 4 dots as they moved around the screen while ignoring all the other moving dots. So again, there was no real top-down attention target goal, rather it was a case of bottom-up attention followed by conceptual goals to follow those 4 dots. Previously, I gave an example of a top-down focal attention target where an outfielder's controller would ask the modeler to pay attention to a fly ball so he could catch the ball. For an experienced outfielder, this would be an automatic habitual bottom-up attention goal that has been learned by the modeler. Just as the controller can have habitual behaviors, the modeler can have habitual bottom-up attention targets that presumably have been trained by the controller. For example, an experienced outfielder would have trained several different automatic habitual target goals, and these goals would be conditional on being in the outfield. Just one example of such a habit would be that if the batter swings his bat and hits the ball, direct attention to the ball. This is an argument that true top-down attention is rare, and that most focal attention targets are the result of the modeler's bottom-up attention mechanism. The rare top-down focal attention target would still have an activated corresponding diffuse attention schema arrow location. This means that the focal and diffuse attention mechanisms are very tightly integrated, like this. They are tightly integrated because every focal attention schema arrow in the focal attention mechanism is an extension of the associated activated diffuse attention schema arrow of the diffuse attention mechanism. The focal models in the focal attention mechanism are copies of small regions of the world model that is continually updated by the diffuse attention mechanism. So let's look at how the modeler and the diffuse attention mechanism updates the world model and controls attention. We'll start with the world model updating. Let me preface this part of the talk by saying that the sequential procedural processing steps I will be describing here is not the way the brain implements this functionality. I am talking like a software engineer here, and I am describing the functionality needed using the language of software engineering. However, I am absolutely certain that evolution has not used this particular design paradigm to produce the human brain. Brains are massively parallel processors that do not follow these kinds of sequential processing steps. So treat this as a rough description of the kinds of functionality the brain somehow implements, rather than a description of how the brain implements this functionality. So to update the world model, the modeler starts by continuously recognizing all the sensory objects contained in the current sensory inputs and comparing those objects to the equivalent objects in the world model. I claim that this is where diffuse awareness experience occurs. Then for each sensory object, if the sensory object differs from the object in the current world model, the modeler will activate the diffuse attention schema location and update the world model appropriately. Note that the object could differ because it was a brand new object or because some existing object changed in some way. An example of a change could be that the object moved or rotated. The new object may have been predicted by the world model, or it may have been a surprise. Then we start the process of checking the changed or new object to see if it should generate a bottom-up attention target. Now I will describe how the new or changed object is checked. This will start by seeing if it has a new object and if the new object was not predicted by the world model. Then we automatically try to make it a new bottom-up focal attention target. We do this because a brand new unpredicted object should be checked by the controller to see if it is a significant issue or not. On the other hand, if it was a changed object, and if the change to the object was not predicted, we should go through some additional checks before we make it a bottom-up focal target. On the other hand, if the new or changed object was exactly what the world model predicted, then there is nothing to see here, and we are not making a new bottom-up target, so we should just deactivate the diffuse attention schema arrow location and continue to process the next new or changed object. If the changed object was not predicted, then we want to do some further checks on the object. So, if the change to the object is very surprising, or if the object has a memory trace that has an associated very significant positive or negative affect, then we want to try to make it a new bottom-up focal target. The reason for checking the memory of a new or changed object is that the memory of an object will also tell us if there are strong positive or negative feelings or emotions associated with that object. These remembered feelings or emotions were generated by the controller when it encountered this object in the past. So it is an indication that the controller has a strong attractive or aversive relationship with the object. So let the controller know that the object is back again. Note that the amount of surprise or significance in these checks could be compared to a threshold that could be adjusted to limit the number of bottom-up targets that are generated. The process of attempting to make a new bottom-up focal target has one additional check involved. We've already seen that the number of allowed focal targets is limited. For example, in the moving dot case, somewhere between 1 and 8 dots could be tracked simultaneously, depending on the speed of the dots. Remember, this tracking of dots is accomplished by keeping focal attention directed at these moving dots. This means that if we have already reached the limit on the number of focal targets, then when a new focal target is proposed, we would either have to drop some current focal target or drop the new target, depending on which target was the least important. One other thing about checking the change or new object process. At the beginning of the process, the relative diffuse attention schema arrow location is activated, and then after some checks, the activated arrow may become a focal target location, or maybe it doesn't. Then at the end, the diffuse attention schema arrow location is deactivated. This temporary activation and deactivation is one example of why the diffuse attention schema is needed and how it is used to control this process. Another reason why the diffuse attention schema is needed is to track all the current focal attention targets. If the activated diffuse attention schema arrow location did become a focal target arrow location, then a focal attention schema arrow is created, and the diffuse attention schema arrow stays activated while the focal attention target is active. If the diffuse attention schema was just a static ball of arrows that never changed, it would have no significance at all. It could not be a simplified model of this complex process. These temporary and longer-term activations make the diffuse attention schema a very dynamic object which is constantly tracking the dynamic processes of the diffuse and focal attention mechanisms. So the focal and diffuse attention schemas are the models of this complex process, which are exactly the kind of models the good regulator theorem requires so the modeler can control this process. Now there are a few additional focal targets that need to be generated due to requests from the controller. During the diffuse awareness experience, when all sensory objects are compared to the corresponding world model objects, if a conceptual attention goal was requested by the controller, then the modeler needs to add the appropriate focal target to match that goal condition. One example of this case was a conceptual attention goal that was asked for focal targets for any red objects in the crowd. Finally, if a habitual attention target condition is met, then add the focal target specified by that attention habit. For example, an example of this case was the habitual attention condition of when I'm an outfielder, then add a focal target for the ball hit by the batter. Now let's look at diffuse awareness and why bottom-up focal attention targets are generated. First of all, the generation of diffuse awareness experience occurs when the sensory objects are compared to the world model objects. Sometimes this also gives us a new focal target, and most of these focal targets are to give the controller information it requested, such as conceptual attention goals, or habitual attention targets, or objects that have memories with strong positive or negative affect associated with them. Note that in all these cases, the controller effectively requested these focal targets. Conceptual targets definitely come from the controller, habitual target goals are trained by the controller, and the controller produced the strong affect that was stored in the memory trace for the object. So all these focal targets effectively came from the controller. However, on rare occasions, the new focal target will come from the modeler itself. This is when the modeler was very surprised by the change to the world model. Perhaps this was the detection of a new object where no new object was expected, or an object changed in a way that was unexpected. An example would be an object that was moving in a straight line that suddenly and unexpectedly changed its direction of motion. There are two reasons why the modeler would bring this to the attention of the controller. First, the controller may need to do some action because this world model change was unexpected. The other reason would be the hope that the controller can figure out why this unexpected change occurred, and hopefully the controller could help to modify the world model using its conscious thoughts so the modeler would not be surprised by changes like this in the future. This is a very short summary of the very complex process the modeler uses to control and direct attention. We have described how the modeler updates the world model and constructs both the focal and diffuse attention schemas. The final model in the complete world that we have to update is the focal model. This is relatively straightforward. The current set of focal attention targets completely determines the focal model. Basically, the focal attention schema specifies which limited parts of the world model should be copied into the focal models. Thus, this completes the construction of all 4 parts of the modeler's complete world. According to the good regulator theorem, to control this complicated process, the modeler needs a simplified model of that process, which is exactly the focal attention schema plus the diffuse attention schema. Some final points about awareness in general. All these diffuse attention schema error locations determine all possible focal attention targets, and thus these possible attention targets are all the things that we can be aware of with either diffuse awareness or focal awareness. There are lots of unconscious processes in the brain, so you might wonder why some brain processes are unconscious and some are available to conscious awareness. My hypothesis is that we are potentially conscious of exactly the diffuse attention schema error locations which can directly affect the current world model. Let's go through the list. All senses that we can be aware of will affect the sensory world model. Inner visualizations can also update the sensory world model. Language input and the inner voice can update the abstract conceptual world model. And feelings or emotions get stored along with memories of objects or situations, and these memories are part of the world model. In other words, the world model never changes without there being the possibility of having a conscious awareness of why the world model has changed. The great majority of the processing that occurs in the brain are completely unconscious. Only the brain processes that directly affect the world model are candidates for awareness. That is why all of the modeler is unconscious except for the world model itself. We are unaware of all the sensory or abstract conceptual processing or the search for bottom-up attention targets, unless the bottom-up attention target search was successful at creating a new focal attention target. Then we, the controller, will have a focal awareness of the new focal model. And all of the controller is unconscious except for thoughts, feelings, and emotions, since these are the outputs of the controller that can change the world model. So we are unaware of habitual or automatic reactions, or even the carefully planned actions of the controller. We, the modeler, know about these actions when we experience the body moving. There's even evidence that we learn about the controller's generation of speech when we hear what the controller says. We're also unaware of all the internal processing in the controller that results in the outputs of the thoughts, feelings, and emotions. The reasons why all these processes are unconscious is because they do not directly cause changes in the world model. Only the sensory and language inputs, the conscious thoughts, and the feelings directly cause changes to the world model, and that is why we can be aware of them. Let's review what we know about the 2 different attention mechanisms. The focal attention mechanism implements both top-down and bottom-up focal attention, and it also produces the focal awareness experience. Finally, according to attention schema theory, the focal attention schema is a model of the focal awareness experience. On the other hand, the diffuse attention mechanism updates the world model and finds bottom-up focal attention targets, and it also produces the diffuse awareness experience. Finally, according to extended attention schema theory, the diffuse attention schema is a model of the diffuse awareness experience. Now let's look at attention schema theory's detailed awareness models for each of our agents. We've already explained the 2 kinds of attention schemas, and we have also described the world model and the focal models. The remaining type of models that we need in order to apply attention schema theory is a self-model of our 3 agents. So let's start with the controller self-model. There are 2 parts in the controller self-model. First of all, in the abstract conceptual world, the controller self-model is the concept that I've named the I, me, my. This is the conceptual autobiographical narrative self-model. It is basically every abstract conceptual fact that I know about me, which would include my history, my goals, my plans, my friends and family, etc. In the sensory world model, the controller self-model would be the body schema. This body schema is a sensory model of the physical body, and hence it would include things such as the approximate current angles of all the joints, the sizes and positions of the limbs, the head and the torso, and the location of the body in the world model. It also includes a model of the capabilities of the body, like how fast I can run or how high I can jump. So the controller self model will be the I, me, my plus the body schema. Now the modeler doesn't perform any significant actions in the external world, so you might think it does not need a self model. After all, the only physical action the modeler has any control over is to move the eyes to direct central vision, and that I claim is not a very significant action. The most significant action the modeler performs is to update the world model and to direct attention, and directing attention does significantly change the modeler's complete world models. So the modeler should have significant self-models in the complete world models, as we will see on this slide. Consider, in the focal awareness world, for example, the actions the modeler performs are to direct both top-down and bottom-up focal attention. The way the modeler directs the focal attention is by controlling the focal attention mechanism. The simplified model of that focal attention mechanism is exactly the focal attention schema. Therefore, the modeler's focal self-model in the focal awareness world is exactly the focal attention schema. Note that this is a very significant self-model, since changes to the focal attention schema makes very significant changes to the focal model. Similarly, in the diffuse awareness world, the actions the modeler performs are to update the world model, define bottom-up focal attention targets. The way the modeler performs those functions is by controlling the diffuse attention schema. The required simplified model of that diffuse attention schema mechanism is exactly the diffuse attention schema. Therefore, the modeler's diffuse self-model in the diffuse awareness world is exactly the diffuse attention schema. Again, note that this is a very significant self-model, since both the focal attention schema and the focal model are changed significantly by the attention mechanism when it finds new bottom-up focal attention targets. So now we know that the modeler's self-model is exactly the focal attention schema when you're talking about focal awareness, and the diffuse attention schema when you're talking about diffuse awareness. Therefore, let's fill out a self-model table for all three agents. Now, attention schema theory says that an attention schema is a model of awareness. So the combination of focal plus diffuse attention schemas would correspond to awareness in general, whether it is focal awareness or diffuse awareness. Therefore, according to attention schema theory, you can replace the focal and diffuse attention schemas with a single word, awareness. Just think about that for a minute. Every time you notice the experience of awareness, you are noticing your modeler's self-model. And finally, the human self-model will be some combination of the controller and modeler's self-models shown above. Now, attention schema theory says that an agent needs an attention schema in order to have awareness. Professor Graziano, the author of attention schema theory, makes this claim in an article in The Atlantic, where he suggests, for example, that the hydra, which is a primitive aquatic animal, probably does not have an attention mechanism or an attention schema, and therefore the hydra probably does not have awareness. Now, the only agent that creates either kind of attention schema is the modeler, and of course the modeler self-model is exactly the two different attention schemas. Therefore, only the modeler is conscious all by itself. So to get three conscious agents, we need to add the modeler to each of the other two agents. The modeler by itself is conscious, and when we apply attention schema theory to the modeler, we will use the modeler's self-model of awareness. To get a conscious controller, we will combine it with the modeler, and for the attention schema theory, we will use the controller's self-model. For human consciousness, we will use a combination of the controller consciousness and modeler consciousness, and the human self-model will be a combination of the controller's and modeler's self-models in various proportions. By changing the proportions of the controller and modeler's self-model in the human self-model, we can explain several different kinds of human consciousness. Since the modeler is the ultimate source of conscious awareness for all these agents, let's define fundamental consciousness to be the modeler's consciousness. So fundamental consciousness includes the modeler's diffuse and focal awareness. Now let's look at the distinction between phenomenal consciousness versus access consciousness proposed by NYU philosophy professor Ned Block. Phenomenal consciousness is experience. The phenomenally conscious aspect of a state is what it is like to be in that state, i.e. the qualia. Qualia is a term coined by philosophers to describe subjective conscious experiences such as the perceived sensations of the pain of a headache, the taste of wine, or the redness of an evening sky. Access consciousness is availability for use in reasoning and in guiding speech and action. Of the two agents, only the controller reasons, speaks, or acts, so the controller must be the agent that has access consciousness. Access consciousness is really equivalent to the skills that artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms are getting better at implementing these days. For example, self-driving cars can take in sensory information about the environment and successfully drive cars in all kinds of conditions. So these self-driving car agents have goals and are constructing a model of the world and a model of the car itself in that world. There are also artificial intelligence algorithms that are getting better and better at reasoning, speaking, and acting, almost like a human being. On the other hand, phenomenal consciousness is the aspect of consciousness that seems mysterious and hard to understand. In particular, the so-called hard problem of consciousness is to explain phenomenal consciousness. The hard problem is usually stated as the problem of explaining why there is something it is like for a subject in a conscious experience. In fact, some philosophers claim that the hard problem cannot be solved. I am not claiming to have a solution to the hard problem, but I do think this model provides some useful insights about this hard problem. I will also use the term phenomenal awareness and access awareness interchangeably with phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Let's look at where these two kinds of consciousness occur in our two-agent diagram. These two different kinds of attention mechanisms lead to two different kinds of awareness. As you see, diffuse awareness can only occur in the modeler, hence only the modeler can have phenomenal consciousness of diffuse awareness. Can there be access consciousness for diffuse awareness? No. Remember that when we tried to describe diffuse awareness objects, we needed to direct focal attention to the object, so we needed focal awareness to describe these objects. Hence, there cannot be access consciousness for diffuse awareness. But what about access consciousness for focal awareness? That can only occur in the controller, since only the controller can reason, speak, and act. So the only remaining question is, what about phenomenal consciousness of focal awareness? Is it in both agents, or only in one agent, such as the controller? It doesn't make sense for this to be in the controller. If it were, we would have to have two completely different neural networks and two different agents that implemented exactly the same kind of phenomenal consciousness. For example, let's say you are looking at a uniformly green wall. The center of vision is having a focal awareness experience of the green color, and that would have to exactly match the diffuse awareness green color of the rest of the wall. How can two completely different neural networks and two different agents produce exactly the same experience of the color green? That would be very difficult to arrange and very wasteful in neural resources. So I claim that both the focal and diffuse phenomenal awareness must be in the modeler. At least this way they can share some of the same neural circuitry. In fact, I am convinced that they share 100% of the same neural circuitry. After all, the focal model is a strict subset of the world model. So if we compute phenomenal consciousness for the whole world model, we automatically have exactly the same kind of phenomenal consciousness available for the focal model. Therefore, there is only one neural mechanism that computes phenomenal consciousness. So all phenomenal consciousness is implemented in the modeler, and all access consciousness is implemented in the controller. Let's fill out this table. The controller only has access consciousness for focal awareness, and the modeler's diffuse awareness of the world model is the source of all phenomenal awareness. The modeler's focal phenomenal awareness is just a copy of the diffuse phenomenal awareness. So there is only one access consciousness for the controller's focal awareness and phenomenal consciousness for the modeler's diffuse awareness. Therefore, fundamental conscious awareness is purely phenomenal awareness. Now, if the experience of colors comes from phenomenal consciousness,
so how is it that the controller can report the colors of objects, for example? If our focal model is this apple, how could the controller report the color of that pixel? What happens, I believe, is that the focal model is not just the image there, but it's also everything that the modeler knows about the objects in that image. For example, it would know there's a pixel type object here which has a color of lime green, and this is the word label for that color property. And at the same time, the modeler would have the experience label of that experience of the lime green color. So for the color property, there are two possible labels: the lime green word label or the lime green color experience label. Similarly, the object as a whole here would be a green apple object, and this would be the brown stem object. So let's look at the hard problem. From the controller's point of view, I is looking out through the sense organs and seeing a green apple out there in the world. This green color experience seems like it is out there in the world on the surface of that apple. This is hard to explain. How can an experience exist out in the world? On the other hand, the truth is that information is coming in from the apple, and the information goes through the sense organs into the modeler, and the modeler constructs a model of that apple. When the modeler directs attention to that apple, attention schema theory would say that the controller would have the awareness of the green color of the apple. But notice that this green color experience is only in here in the world model. It is not out in the physical world. This is much easier to explain. The green experience is the label for the color property of the object. And everything is completely arbitrary in here. So not only is the green experience made up by the modeler when it's creating the model of the world, but the experience is also made up by the modeler. The experience is a property of the attention mechanism there. The attention arrow there has that property of experience, and it's just made up by the modeler. So I don't think this is a really hard problem in this model.
I think this model can also provide some valuable predictions about the neurocorrelates of consciousness for these two types of consciousness. The neurocorrelates of consciousness are defined as the minimal set of neuronal events and mechanisms sufficient for a specific conscious percept. Neuroscientists look for the neurocorrelates of consciousness by comparing the activity of the brain when the subject is consciously aware of a perception versus the activity when they are not aware of their perception. Let's see what this model would say about the NCCs for access consciousness. The prediction is that the access consciousness NCC would be found in the brain network that implements the focal attention mechanism that exists in both the modeler and the controller. For example, if we were talking about access consciousness for visual focal awareness, the NCC would probably start at the back of the brain where the primary visual cortex is located, would go all the way to the frontal lobes where the controller is probably implemented. In fact, the back three lobes of the brain contain all the sensory cortex for all the senses, so the modeler may consist of most of the back three lobes, and the controller may consist of mostly the frontal lobes. This means the modeler may be approximately 60% of the brain's cortex, and the controller may be 40%. There are undoubtedly some of the modeler's neural circuits in the frontal lobes, and some of the controller's circuits are in the back three lobes. But to zeroth order, it may be that the modeler is roughly 60% and the controller is roughly 40% of the entire brain. And there would be no phenomenal consciousness in this NCC, since phenomenal awareness would come from the diffuse attention mechanism. On the other hand, phenomenal consciousness would be found in the brain networks that implement diffuse awareness. These are the networks which also update the world model and finds bottom-up focal targets. This network would be very difficult to find, since these networks would always have a constant low level of activity. An fMRI machine can only be used to identify brain regions that have high activity in one circumstance and low activity in another circumstance. If the network always has just a constant low level of activity, You cannot use an fMRI machine to demonstrate anything. To measure phenomenal awareness without focal awareness, you cannot allow a bottom-up attention target to be found because that would activate the focal attention access consciousness NCC. So to measure phenomenal awareness with an fMRI machine, the bottom-up focal target mechanism must be activated slightly. You have to do that without actually triggering the corresponding focal attention network. Returning to the access consciousness, it turns out that the NCCs for access consciousness has already been measured. The idea is to briefly present targets with masking so that only 50% of the targets trigger access consciousness and are thus reported by the controller. The masking before and after the briefly presented image are needed, since otherwise the briefly presented image would be very visible as an after image. Then the neuroscientists use fMRI to measure the activated part of the brain when the trigger is reported and subtract the activation when the trigger is not reported. The activation when the trigger is reported is the neurocorrelates of access consciousness plus phenomenal consciousness. And activation when the trigger is not reported will be just the neurocorrelates of phenomenal consciousness. The result is just exactly the neurocorrelates of access consciousness, which are the neurons involving the focal attention mechanism. Here's an example of the kind of experiment that measures this. So an image of a word is presented for something like 50 milliseconds, which presumably is the time where the subject reports the presence of the word only about half the time. As I said, the colored rectangle images are required to prevent an afterimage of the word from being always visible to the subject. The differences in activation when the word is reported and not reported is the neurocorrelates of access awareness. This is typically a network of neurons connecting the visual cortex to the frontal lobes, which is what would be expected. It would be much more difficult to measure neurocorrelates of phenomenal consciousness. For example, it is necessary to ensure that full access awareness is not triggered. We will want to compare the activation when we have a signal that triggers phenomenal awareness without triggering access awareness to a similar situation which does not even trigger phenomenal awareness. Thus, we need a strong potential bottom-up focal attention target that only starts to trigger the bottom-up attention and then stops before the access awareness is triggered. This has sort of been measured using perceptual and conceptual priming experiments. I claim that priming experiments give evidence for phenomenal awareness without access awareness. Let's take a look at how priming experiments work. Basically, a priming experiment presents a target image or word for such a short time that the subject does not ever experience access awareness. That is, the subject always reports that it didn't see anything. The priming effect is demonstrated when subsequent responses to a question are still affected by the short presentation of the unseen primed image or word. For example, if an unseen image of a dog is presented and the subject is later asked to name an animal, they are much more likely to name a dog. To show that we have phenomenal awareness, we must show that the trigger was still processed by the modeler. The priming effect is evidence that some preliminary bottom-up focal attention target processing had occurred. An example of a priming experiment is shown here. As I said, if an unreported image of a dog is presented, when the subject is later asked to name an animal, they are much more likely to say dog than if an image of a different kind of animal was presented. This means the image of the dog was processed by bottom-up attention mechanism to such an extent that the memory of the dog concept was accessed. It is this accessing of the dog memory trace that makes it more likely that the word dog will be the answer to a subsequent question. Therefore, there was phenomenal awareness of the dog image without having an access awareness of that image. The problem with this experiment is that the colored rectangles are presented for a longer time, so lots of access consciousness for those masking images would occur. And that would also overwhelm the effect we are trying to measure, which is a weak phenomenal awareness of the dog image. The other problem is that the rectangles will also trigger very strong phenomenal consciousness, which again would overwhelm the subtle phenomenal awareness of the dog image. Neuroscientists have used priming experiments to measure some significant signals in the brain. For example, in this experiment, since the dog image would presumably trigger a semantic word part of the brain that the rectangles would not trigger, they have measured the semantic word part of the brain using this kind of priming experiment. My suggestion for an experiment that might be more effective at measuring phenomenal consciousness is shown here. The idea is to present all images for the same short period of time, but have the masking images look like visual white noise so that no meaningful phenomenal awareness would be triggered, except for the target image, where a meaningful image is presented on the white noise background. The other thing that could be done here is to present the target image to different locations on the visual field. The advantage of doing this is that you could measure the correlation between the location of the dog's image on the visual field with a region of visual cortex with a phenomenal awareness with an increased activation. If that matches previously measured correlations of image location and visual cortex location, this would be additional evidence that a significant and meaningful signal was measured. Hopefully this kind of experiment could produce a measurement of the NCC for phenomenal consciousness. Now let's get back to applying attention schema theory to our agents. Attention schema theory says that the attention schema is a model of awareness. So in our terminology, this says that the focal attention schema is a model of the focal awareness of the focal model. Similarly, we have extended attention schema theory to diffuse awareness mechanism, so the diffuse attention schema is a model of diffuse awareness of the world model. Here are these statements explained in pictures for focal awareness. The attention schema theory model is the self model plus the focal attention schema plus the focal model. In sensory experiences, this would be the self model has the experience of focal awareness of the focal model. And in words, this would be, I am aware of the object. Here are corresponding pictures for diffuse awareness. The extended attention schema theory model is the self model plus the diffuse attention schema plus the world model. In sensory experiences, this would be the self model has the experience of diffuse awareness of the entire world model. And in words, this would be, I am aware of the world. Let's apply this focal awareness model to objects, concepts, and to the self itself. So here are the models of focal awareness for objects, concepts, and the self itself. Attention schema theory says the focal attention schema is awareness. Now, awareness of a concept is really recognizing that it is a known concept. So we have the self model aware of the object, the self model recognizes the concept, and the self model is aware of the self model. Now let's apply this to model the controller using the conceptual I me my part of the controller self model. We then get awareness expressed in the words, I am aware of the object, I recognize the concept, and I am aware of me. Now let's look at a controller's focal awareness models using the sensory body schema part of the controller self model. Remember that the controller consciousness is composed of the modeler combined with the controller. So in this case, the controller consciousness inherits the modeler's phenomenal awareness, which are experienced as qualia, or sensory representations, while using the controller's sensory body schema self-model. Thus, the experiences are the body having sensory phenomenal awareness experiences of an object, a concept, and the model itself. The qualia or sensory experiences are body aware object, body recognized concept, body aware body. Now let's look at the modeler's focal awareness models. Remember that the modeler all by itself is conscious and that the only kind of awareness it has is phenomenal awareness. The modeler's focal self-models is the focal attention schema, which is awareness. So the results of these models, where all of these awarenesses are pointing to an object, or pointing to a concept, or pointing to awareness itself. Removing the redundant awarenesses, we have a selfless awareness of an object, and a selfless recognition of a concept, and a selfless, locationless, objectless awareness of awareness. This awareness of awareness could also be experienced as a sense of presence. This is a selfless, locationless, non-physical sense of existence. Perhaps this is what some religions call the concept of a soul. Now let's look at the modeler's diffuse awareness models. It doesn't make sense to have diffuse awareness of concepts, so we will only consider diffuse awareness of the whole world model and diffuse awareness of the self model. The modeler's diffuse awareness self model is the diffuse attention schema. And all these diffuse attention schemas always point to the whole world model. So for the modeler's diffuse self-awareness, there must be an implicit world model. These redundant diffuse attention schemas can be removed. And these final two diffuse attention schemas are awareness. So the modeler's world model awareness and self-awareness are exactly the same, which is a selfless awareness of the world model. Some of the Eastern spiritual traditions that talk about enlightenment say that enlightenment is the realization of non-duality, and that non-duality is said to occur when one experiences that the self-other distinction is an illusion. This is the experience of self, and this is the experience of other. Therefore, since these two experiences are exactly equal, this means the modeler's diffuse awareness has an experience of non-duality. An equivalent way of experiencing non-duality is to experience that the world and I are one, which is also experienced in this modeler's diffuse awareness state. Since fundamental consciousness is the modeler's consciousness, fundamental consciousness is also selfless. And the modeler's focal self-awareness gives a sense of presence, which is a selfless, locationless, non-physical existence. Similarly, the modeler's self-awareness gives a sense of non-duality, which has no subject-object distinction, or has the experience that the world and I are one. Now let's go on to discuss possible human self-models. This human self-model has two slots that indicate the percentage of the controller's and modeler's self-models that are contained in the human self-model. I claim that most modern, normal humans identify completely with the controller. This means the normal modern human is sure that they control the body directly, and that they produce all language output, and that they are the source of their thoughts, and that they are the cause of their feelings. This normal modern human identifies completely with the controller. Going back to the human self-model, I am convinced that a significant amount of meditation practice can alter this normal modern human self-model to include a significant amount of identification with the modeler self-model. Now remember that according to attention schema theory, the modeler self-model is awareness. So this implies the human is identifying with awareness itself. Consider that many meditation practices are all about controlling the focal attention mechanism and experiencing focal awareness. So this identification with awareness is the human identifying with that part of the human who is aware, and that is the modeler. Without a meditation practice, the normal modern human may not even be aware of awareness. Normal modern human thinks that they are just experiencing the actual world directly. They are never even thinking about the subject of awareness. Many meditation methods direct focal attention onto meditation objects, such as the breath, the body, a mantra, a candle flame, or an internally visualized image. One type of meditation, called noting, encourages rapidly generating bottom-up focal attention targets as the meditation object. In addition, some meditation practices could lead to an experience of the diffuse awareness of the whole world model. Remember that only the modeler can have that diffuse sensory world model awareness. So in that earlier experiment where you switched back and forth from focal awareness to diffuse awareness, you might have been temporarily increasing the amount of the modeler self-model in your human self-model. Many meditation objects are various kinds of sensory objects, which result in the experience of focal awareness of those objects. Meditation practices can also lead to being aware of our thoughts without identifying ourselves as the source of our thoughts. And we can also become aware of our feelings without identifying ourselves as the source of our feelings. Meditation practices that control focal attention leads to identification with that part of us that directs attention, and of course the modeler is the entity that directs attention. All of this leads to identification with the modeler. So with meditation practices, the modeler's self-model becomes a significant part of the human's self-model. And this is equivalent to identifying with awareness itself. Another state of consciousness, which is sometimes experienced, is the flow state. This state is often reported by artists, musicians, writers, and athletes, but it can be experienced by anyone who becomes totally absorbed by some task. My hypothesis is that in the flow state, the human self-model is an equal admixture of modeler and controller. The commonly reported attributes of the flow state include a loss of self-consciousness. Remember, the modeler has selfless awareness. There's also an intense concentration on the now, which is exactly what the modeler does. It is the controller that is often off living in the past or future. When the controller is thinking about the past, it sometimes experiences resentment. And when it's thinking about the future, a fear about what might happen in the future could be triggered. There's also a merging of action and awareness, which could be expected if the identification with the modeler and controller were roughly equal. So the flow state is consistent with this kind of a self-model for the human. The enlightened states of consciousness reported by some Eastern spiritual traditions have some superficial similarities to the flow state. My hypothesis is that these enlightened states would be dominated by the modeler self-model even more than this flow state of consciousness. Some commonly reported attributes of this enlightened states include selfless awareness. This includes a sense of non-duality, which would come from the modeler's diffuse self-awareness, a sense of presence, which would come from the modeler's focal self-awareness, and no sense of agency, which would come from the modeler, since it is only the controller that is the source of all actions. My hypothesis is that there can be a range of enlightened states which have more and more modeler self-model and less controller self-model. The flow state is transient, but reports are that the enlightened states, especially the fully enlightened state, is much more persistent. You could also view these enlightened states as being more extreme and more persistent versions of the flow state. Now let's look at the question, who are you, using these proposed models of the human self-model? You would be a typical modern human if you control the body, if you produce speech, thoughts, and feelings, and if you notice that you have focal awareness. However, if instead of noticing that you have focal awareness, you recognize that you are awareness, then you would be the modern human with some significant meditation practice. You would be in the flow state if your awareness is totally absorbed by the current task, and thus your actions and awareness are balanced and completely unified. You would be in the fully enlightened state if you recognize that you are awareness, that you are aware of the body moving, aware of speech, thoughts, and feelings happening, but you have no sense of agency. There is no sense of agency since it's only the controller that is the source of all activity. Clearly, the fully enlightened state is the fundamental consciousness state, with a focal self-awareness giving a sense of presence, and the diffuse self-awareness giving a sense of non-duality. To finish up, let's review the different kinds of consciousness that we have explained. We have explained the distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness, and we have explained modern human consciousness, including the effect of meditation, flow state consciousness, and enlightened states of consciousness. Finally, let's answer those three questions about conscious awareness that we posed at the beginning. We will answer those questions about the modeler's fundamental consciousness. After all, this fundamental consciousness is the source of all phenomenal awareness, which is the most mysterious aspect of awareness. So this is the kind of consciousness that most needs explanation. The first question is, why does conscious awareness seem to be fundamentally non-physical, to not have a location in space? Both kinds of attention schemas are completely abstract concepts, which means that they are non-physical and have no location in space. An attention schema theory says the attention schemas are awareness. Thus, fundamental conscious awareness seems to be non-physical and to have no spatial location. This is essentially the same reasoning that Professor Graziano gave in the paper referenced here. Note that this is true for fundamental consciousness, but not true for the controller or normal modern human consciousness, since the models of awareness for those agents includes a body schema self-model, which is a model of a physical body and does have a location in the world model. However, although the normal modern consciousness seems to be located in the body, there's really no actual experience of a specific location in the body. We might assume that it's located in the brain, but there's really no direct experience of that. Further, phenomenal awareness certainly does feel like it is a non-physical and mysterious. On the other hand, the modeler's fundamental consciousness is definitely non-physical and has no location in space. For the modeler's non-dual self-awareness, that is true since the I is experienced as being the entire world model. For the modeler's focal self-awareness, with a sense of presence, it is also true since that presence is a sense of existence without a location in space or a body. The next question is, what conditions cause conscious awareness to arise? Fundamental conscious awareness requires that an agent that is making a world model. If that agent is also directing attention, then the agent has an attention schema. Then attention schema theory says that the agent contains fundamental consciousness. If its self-model is only awareness, then it would only have fundamental consciousness. If it has a self-model that also includes a body schema, it would have something like the controller's or normal modern human consciousness. Thus, directing attention in a world model is the fundamental cause of conscious awareness. Philosophers have asked a related question: could a philosophical human zombie exist? A philosophical zombie would look and act exactly like a normal modern human being, but there would be no phenomenal awareness in this zombie. If it acts like a human, then the philosophical zombie would have to have a normal modern human access consciousness. In terms of this model of consciousness, this question is asking, could the controller continue to operate normally if the modeler did not have phenomenal awareness? Let's see how we would have to change our two-agent model to have a philosophical human zombie. Since directing attention is the cause of consciousness, we would have to remove the ability to direct attention. Directing attention produces the focal model and focal attention schema, which are shared with the controller through this interface. So we'd have to delete this interface. Thus, the controller would be completely isolated from the world model. It could still move and perhaps speak, but it would be blind, deaf, and would have no sense of touch or any other sense. Hence, it could not possibly act like a normal modern human. All it could do is to produce random actions that are unrelated to the world. The only way I can think of to resurrect a normal modern human would be to share the entire world model with the controller. But I claim that the controller would then have to implement the equivalent of a bottom-up and top-down attention mechanism to operate like a normal modern human. So the controller would then have phenomenal awareness. Let's take an example of a self-driving car. I was a software engineer for many years, but I don't personally know anything about the software of self-driving cars. But this is what I think would have to be implemented in that car. Let's say that you're driving on a freeway in heavy traffic. If the car on our right starts to move toward us, the car would have to do the equivalent of directing bottom-up attention at that car on the right to see if it really does pose a danger of a collision. If it does, then the car would have to direct top-down attention to the lane on the left to see if there is room there for us to move into that lane to avoid a collision. So the car's controller would have to effectively direct both top-down and bottom-up attention in order to drive the way a normal modern human would drive. So my answer is probably no. It is probably impossible to act like a human without doing the equivalent of directing attention in a world model somewhere in the agent, and hence the agent will have consciousness. Of course, if attention schema theory is correct, the self-driving car that implements both a top-down and bottom-up attention mechanism would also be conscious. Some people, including Professor Graziano, thinks that attention schema theory does tell us how to make conscious computers. On the other hand, some people claim that attention schema theory must be wrong since it implies computers can be consciousness. Which side are you on? Next, we have the question of can conscious awareness exist without a self? The answer is yes. The modeler's fundamental consciousness is selfless. This model also explains why the controller and most normal modern humans believe they are the I am I concept and the physical body, since that is what their self-model is in the abstract conceptual world model and in the sensory world model, respectively. That's the end of this talk, which described part 1 of the book. Part 1 is where I attempted to provide an explanation of consciousness. Next, in part 2 of the book, I will attempt to provide an explanation of spirituality. In part 2, I will rename the modeler as the experiencer. After all, we've shown that only the modeler is responsible for all of our phenomenal awareness experiences, so that justifies the name experiencer for that agent. Then I will decompose the controller into the thinker and doer by using dual process theory from psychology and the action-outcome stimulus-response model from neuroscience. The new model in part 2 will be able to explain the following items. It will explain additional properties and kinds of consciousness, the fundamental differences between animals and humans, and a rare neurological condition called autoactivation deficit. And last but not least, the reason for the development of spirituality in modern humans and the benefits of spiritual practices. I believe these additional explanations are compelling and amount to strong additional evidence for this model. About spirituality, the quick synopsis is that I will show that the development of the thinker in modern humans causes suffering and that spiritual practices can ameliorate that suffering. By the way, this is a non-theistic explanation of spirituality. There is nothing that is supernatural in this explanation. Everything is completely consistent with the currently known laws of physics. This explanation does not require any kind of God. After all, non-theistic spiritual traditions do exist. However, this model also provides an explanation of why some spiritual paths insist there is a God. Finally, here is the bibliography of the talk. And that is the end of this talk. I welcome feedback, and please check out my website. The most important thing to do is to click on the Sign Up Now button on almost any page of the website. If you do this, you will get an occasional email notification when there is new content available on the website, such as when the next video is available, and I hope that within a year or so, you will receive the notification of the publication date of the book. Thanks for your attention.